The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello there, a very warm welcome indeed to this brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. I am really excited about today's story. I feel like it's been absolutely ages since I covered a UFO related story on the podcast. And this one is something a little bit different. Not only does it have multiple layers, but there's also a great twist as well. Plus, it takes place in Yorkshire, a county that's close to my heart, somewhere where I lived for 3 years. So it really does tick all of the boxes for me. This is the tale of the Silpho Moor UFO Incident, and I have a feeling this one is going to divide opinion. So let's get right on into it. On the 9th of December 1957, an incredibly intriguing article appeared in the Yorkshire Post newspaper. It featured a photograph of a man holding a serving plate-sized object in the shape of a disc, which very much resembled a miniature version of the classic UFO. The accompanying headline read, "Mystery Object Found on Scarborough Moors," and in case this wasn't eye-catching enough, the subheading was enough to make even the most skeptical readers take a second look. This secondary line read, "Has unusual hieroglyphs," with the text above the photo asking the simple question I'm sure was on many people's lips. Has Yorkshire got a flying saucer? At this time, there was a huge buzz about the idea of space and space exploration, as the discovery of this strange object came just weeks after the launch of Sputnik 1, the very first artificial Earth satellite. So what in the world, whichever world that may be, was going on? Here is what we know. Earlier that year, in 1957, a businessman named Frank Dickinson claimed that he had been driving up Resty Hill, near to the small village of Silpho in North Yorkshire, when something out of this world happened right before his eyes. Frank, who was 42 years old at the time, was in the vehicle with 2 of his friends, when all of a sudden, the car abruptly stalled. Almost directly afterwards, the 3 men noticed what they described as a glowing object in the sky, which they then saw fall down towards the ground and land on a ridge in Broxer Forest near Silpho Moor, very close to where they were. Given their proximity to where they believed it had crashed, Frank decided that he had to know more about this weird object. He got out of the car and scrambled up the steep embankment, and after walking for a short while, he located what he had been looking for. As he approached the object, it became clear that it was the shape of a slightly flattened spinning top, around 45 centimeters in diameter. Frank inspected the saucer, which weighed around 15 kilograms, and noted that it was made of metal and had an overall very mysterious appearance. In what I can only imagine was a state of either bemusement or excitement, possibly both at the same time, Frank knew that his friends needed to see what he had found, and he started to make his way back to the car in order to bring them to the disc's landing site. As he walked back towards the vehicle along a footpath, he encountered a young couple who walked past him in the direction of where the flying saucer still lay. Why he left it there rather than taking it back to the car with him, we don't know, but my guess is that he wanted to show his friends the scene as it was, untouched. He didn't think all that much about the couple he'd seen until he returned to the spot with his 2 friends and discovered that the object had vanished. Imagine how frustrating that would be. I know I would be worried that my friends were thinking I'd made the whole thing up. I might even start to question whether I'd seen it at all, but it seems that Frank was pretty certain of what he'd experienced. As it was the nearest large town to the area, he decided to place a classified advert in a Scarborough newspaper, appealing for any information on the object or its whereabouts, and he didn't have to wait too long for a response. He was contacted by a man who it's assumed was either part of the couple Frank had spotted or a previously unknown third party who had also seen the glowing orb in the sky that night. The man claimed to have the saucer in his possession, and at first he offered to hand it over to Frank for around £200. It appears that the mysterious man quickly realized his pricing was a little on the ridiculous side, considering that no one really knew what the object was. For all any of them knew, it could just be a bit of scrap metal that had been fly-tipped on the moor. Frank haggled him all the way down to £10, and according to the Yorkshire Post, the two men met under the cover of darkness one night to make their exchange. The unidentified flying object now officially belonged to Frank, and he wasted no time in trying to get to the bottom of exactly what this strange metallic disc really was. Realizing he could only gather so much by looking at the exterior of the piece, he knew that his best course of action was to open it up and see if the inside offered up a few more answers. With the help of two other local men who were interested by the discovery, solicitor Anthony Parker and cafe owner Philip Longbottom, he was able to separate the copper bottom of the saucer from the top, so it was in two halves, and what they found inside was mind-boggling. Alongside traces of glass and metal ash, the men were able to extract something that resembled a book, comprised of thin pages made of copper that were all held together with a coiled copper wire. On these pages were a number of hieroglyphs, clearly containing some kind of coded message, and the men recognized them as being very similar to the markings found on the copper base of the outside of the saucer too. Philip Longbottom set about trying to decipher the quote phonetic type symbols, and after putting in over 100 hours of work, he actually managed to work out the alphabetical letters they corresponded to. The message appeared to be made up of around 2,000 words and had allegedly been written by an extraterrestrial by the name of Ullo, who wanted to warn those on planet Earth about a threat of atomic war. One of the phrases which appeared to be included was, quote, "You will improve or disappear," which is fairly ominous. I think that would send a pretty massive shiver down my spine if I was the one to crack the code. Now, after uncovering such bizarre and puzzling information inside the UFO, you would imagine that this became national news, right? Especially because there were some significant similarities between this and the infamous Roswell incident over in the US state of New Mexico, which had happened just 10 years earlier. The debris found in Roswell was also made of metal and was said to feature hieroglyphs too. So surely this discovery right here in the UK should have had scientists, journalists, and even military organizations queuing up to weigh in on it. Well, that's not quite what happened. Rather than being front page news, following on from Frank, Philip, and Anthony's examination of the saucer, everything fell very, very quiet. Mentions of the Silpho UFO incident slipped away from the public consciousness, and soon it was only those with a keen interest in UFOs who continued to speculate about what had become of the mysterious object. Some questioned whether there was a deliberate wall of silence that had been put up around the existence of the flying saucer. Others wondered whether it had been deemed to be of no importance and discarded as rubbish. And there were even a few more light-hearted theories, like the idea that it had ended up being displayed in a Scarborough fish and chip shop, hidden in plain sight. But ultimately, for over half a century, the location of the Silpho UFO became almost as much of a mystery as the origins of the disc itself. The whole topic became more a part of North Yorkshire folklore than anything else, a footnote rather than a headline, and by 2018, the entire episode had all but faded into obscurity. But all that was about to change. It's here that we we meet a very important figure in this story, Dr. David Clarke. David is a lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University and is considered to be one of the UK's leading experts on folklore and contemporary legends, including UFOs. In fact, according to his website, between the years of 2008 and 2013, he was actually a consultant and curator of the Ministry of Defence's UFO Files project that was conducted by the National Archives. So it feels perfectly fitting that David was one of the people destined to bring the story of the Silpho UFO incident firmly back into the public eye. Whilst he was at the Science Museum in London giving a talk on his work with the UFO files, something extraordinary happened. In his own words, quote, "One of the museum staff tapped me on the shoulder and asked if I was aware that bits of a flying saucer had been kept in a cigarette tin in the museum group store for decades." I can only imagine that his response to this question was something along the lines of, "Tell me everything immediately." But the museum staff did better than that. They invited David to examine what they'd stumbled across in their archives, and when he did so, he realized exactly which flying saucer the remnants had belonged to. None other than the Silpho UFO. The cigarette tin had been found by an exhibition developer named Dr. Khalil Thurlaway, who explained that he, quote, "had been looking at 3 or 4 large folders connected to aviation historian Charles Harvard Gibbs Smith, who was also a UFO enthusiast, and found these items. There's a good chance they are from Silpho Moor, as they correlate to the contemporary descriptions of the find." Khalil is the one who invited David to take a closer look at what he'd found, leaving the lecturer amazed at what he saw when he opened up the cigarette tin. David was met with numerous small pieces of the disc, oddly shaped fragments that matched up with how the Silpho object was described. He spoke to the BBC about the moment Khalil introduced him to the pieces, saying, "He opened the tin box and took out the pieces. It was an amazing revelation. It had just been sitting there for half a century. There must be a lot of it still out there, sitting in someone's attic. Or maybe these are the last remaining pieces." But the unearthing of the fragments was about much more than just the physical pieces. This renewed interest in the Silpho case meant that further details about where on earth the saucer had been for the past few decades also started to come to light, which then prompted a whole new debate and discussion about what the object actually was, or indeed what it wasn't. Could it have really been a UFO? Or did the real explanation lie much closer to home? Let's start with the journey of the object from 1957 to its rediscovery in 2018, and then we'll move on to the theories, although there will be a bit of crossover, as you'll see. So, according to the Yorkshire Post, documentation found in the museum archives revealed that these pieces of the Silpho UFO were sent to London to be examined by experts all the way back in 1963. The newspaper explained that the pieces in question, quote, "included a fused section of the metal and plastic from the outer casing, a length of hollow copper tubing, and tiny pieces of foil from the booklet that was discovered inside," which is so interesting, as it does feel that this was a bit of a cross-section of the key elements of what made the object so fascinating. After reaching the Science Museum, it was decided that some specialist testing should be carried out on the pieces. So they were sent to a man named Gordon Claringbull, who was an expert in meteorites at the Natural History Museum, and after conducting some tests, he concluded that there was, quote, "nothing unusual about them." He sent a document back to the Science Museum, essentially informing them that he was fairly certain certain the metal in the pieces was of an earthly nature, and as we'll find out shortly, this very much plays into the more skeptical theories about the object. But that was not the end of the matter, because it looks as though between the saucer being discovered in 1957 and it ending up in London in 1963, it actually made its way into the hands of someone very, very interesting. And when I first read this, it left me a bit speechless, to be honest. Every time I think I've made up my mind about a UFO incident and become convinced it's nothing out of the ordinary, something crops up to make me question things all over again. And this is a perfect example of that very thing. Air Chief Marshal Lord Dowding of the Royal Air Force, who was the man responsible for leading the RAF to victory during the Battle of Britain in World War II, revealed that he actually personally examined the Silpho UFO in 1959. After holding it in his hands and studying the object, he made a startling statement about what he believed it to be. In his own words, a miniature pilot flying saucer, which he was convinced had genuinely originated from somewhere out of our world. Can you see why this scrambled my head a bit when I read it? You could argue that the Air Chief Marshal of the RAF would be one of the best placed people to comment on the matter of weird objects flying through the sky. So the fact he was so straightforward and clear in stating his position on the saucer's status feels kind of huge, doesn't it? I've tried to find out more about Lord Dowding's encounter with the Silpho UFO, but most sources just seem to state this same snippet of information. However, it is a well-documented fact that he was a believer in the existence of unidentified flying objects. There is an incredible audio clip of him speaking that you can still find on places like YouTube, where he makes an amazing statement about his views on the subject. Here is what he says. The evidence for the existence of flying saucers is so overwhelming that I have long ago accepted it. I am, therefore, very little interested in stories of fresh sightings, unless they refer to some new or rare type of vehicle. What I am interested in is any report or account of personal contact with the occupants. However far-fetched the story may appear to be, it is by analyzing and correlating these often conflicting accounts that we shall, sooner or later, amass a volume of evidence which will enable us to form a useful theory about the facts of interplanetary flight. To me, this very much explains why Lord Dowding was so interested in the Silpho UFO, because it was so much smaller than the kind of craft you might typically think of in this scenario. This endorsement of sorts by someone so prominent in the RAF is another reason why I can't believe this case isn't more widely discussed. I find it endlessly fascinating. However, although I'm not entirely sure where this fits into the timeline, as no dates appear to be mentioned in any of the sources I've found, there was actually yet another study of this flying saucer that was undertaken, and this time it was somewhere even closer to home for me personally, in my local city of Manchester. At some point after its initial discovery in the 50s, presumably before its fragments were eventually located at the Science Museum, the Silpho UFO was also studied at the University of Manchester, and a full report was produced with the findings of this project. In contrast to Lord Dowding's views on the object, the Manchester study was decidedly more skeptical of the saucer's origins, although the researchers did conclude that certain materials on the outer of the disc's shell, including copper and lead, were of an unusually high purity. They also found that there was no evidence that these metals had ever been exposed to the incredibly high temperatures that the saucer would have endured had it really arrived on Earth from somewhere out there in space. And this is the point where we firmly segue into the theory section version of the episode, because one UFO expert who ended up reading the Manchester report made a pretty definitive statement after completing it. The author Jenny Randalls, who has written numerous books on UFOs and previously served as the Director of Investigations at the British UFO Research Association, wasn't at all convinced by the Silpho object's legitimacy. Her damning verdict suggested that the entire incident was actually one of the most well-organized and costly hoaxes that has ever taken place in Britain, adding, quote, "The hoaxers never seemed to gain from it, and whoever had it built spent considerably more than the £10 the finders reportedly paid for it." Dr. David Clarke also notes on his website that, quote, "Skeptics claimed the saucer was made from a domestic hot water cylinder in a backstreet garage and planted on the moor as an elaborate hoax." And I suppose this skepticism is understandable. Maybe the similarities between the Roswell UFO and the Silpho one could indicate some kind of copycat behavior. I mean, if you were going to fake a UFO finding, what could be more intriguing of a hook than having it embossed with hieroglyphs similar to those found on one of the most famous alleged UFO wreckages of all time? Plus, the small size of the craft would have been relatively easy for a human with the right skills and resources to construct. I agree with Jenny Randalls that it would likely have been fairly expensive though, not to mention time-consuming. Creating that book out of thin pages of copper all bound together would have been a delicate process. This isn't the kind of prank that most people would be bothered to go through with unless they were ultimately wanting to gain some kind of glory from it. And that's the thing. As far as I can find out, no one ever claimed any kind of responsibility for the Silpho UFO's creation. Let me propose something hypothetical here. I'm not suggesting in any way that this was the case, but for the sake of argument, let's imagine that the man who discovered the flying saucer on Silpho Moor, Frank Dickinson, had been behind the hoax. If he'd gone through the trouble of making the thing, had paid to get it back after losing it, and tricked his two friends by going through with the whole charade of driving them near to the spot he'd planted it, getting out of the car to find it first, going back to get them, having people analyze it once he'd paid for its return, how would you explain the fact that all three men who were in the car that night saw something in the sky, this glowing object that then crashed onto the moor? That's not the kind of thing you could have faked back in the 1950s, at least not very easily. And this same question applies if the suggestion is that someone other than Frank had been responsible for the hoax. Here's a scenario for you. Imagine that the person who had made the UFO was the same person who had then found it and tried to sell it back to Frank for £200. If he'd really gone to the trouble of creating this entire trap, why would he eventually agree to let it go for only £10? If this person was a true scammer, why wouldn't they just take the flying saucer and try and do their scam again elsewhere? And if it was actually someone who was after glory instead of money, would that person have really gone to such great lengths to pull off this elaborate and intricate plan only to let the story die out in the press the way it did? It's possible that media coverage was maybe never their goal, and perhaps what they really wanted to do was create a local mystery, a local legend, something that people would continue to talk about for a very long time. But something about the logistics of it just doesn't add up for me. If it had happened today, it would be so much easier to write off these weird question marks by saying, oh, they could have used a drone, they could have bought the different elements from a collection of random websites and put them all together to create this really effective looking mini spaceship. But none of this was a possibility in 1957. If it really was a huge prank, I truly have no idea how those behind it pulled it off. So, what's the alternative? I'm sure this will come as no surprise, but there are a number of people out there who lean towards the explanation that the Silpho UFO was indeed extraterrestrial in any given forum post dedicated to the story. Although there aren't that many compared to more famous cases, there will always be people arguing that we should keep an open mind and consider that something out of this world really was at play here. A key point that is raised over and over again relates to what I just mentioned. If it was a hoax, why was the whole thing so quickly abandoned? How did this big plan result in the fragments being forgotten about for multiple decades? To change lanes slightly, there are also others who suggest that the object could have been related to the major news event that had taken place just weeks before it was found, the launch of Sputnik, questioning whether it could have been either debris from some kind of Cold War Soviet space activity or something planted by a world power trying to cause fear about the prospect of atomic attacks. I always find that the fascinating thing about UFO-related stories are that whichever side of the debate you land on, people on the other side would probably say that your opinion is the far-fetched one, because to a certain extent, every single theory sounds a bit bonkers in its own way. Honestly, I think in any UFO case, even if one particular theory was proven beyond all doubt, it still wouldn't stop the debate bubbling away amongst both believers and skeptics. I mean, look at Roswell. The official line was that the debris was part of a weather balloon. Yet to this very day, there are countless people who would argue that this explanation is simply part of a cover-up, and that it really was a genuine UFO. I have no doubt that at least some of those in North Yorkshire who were close to the Silpho Moor story had similar suspicions when their local flying saucer seemed to disappear once the initial media buzz subsided. Where had it gone? Why had everything suddenly gone quiet? Sometimes the less that's said, the more momentum a mystery can gather. So where do I land on this one? No pun intended. If you're a long-time listener, you'll know that I always tend to sit on the fence when it comes to UFO cases. To me, because I've never had any kind of extraterrestrial encounter, I just don't know what to make of a lot of these stories. But I have to admit that the comments from Lord Dowding did make me pause and start to question things a little more. If you think about it, for a man who had such a strong reputation and who held such a high rank in the RAF, to speak out about something like UFOs is genuinely quite something. He wasn't necessarily saying that he was sold on the idea that the kinds of aliens we've seen in films are real, but I still think his words are incredibly interesting. If I had to put myself into a particular category, I'd say that I'm open-minded but not completely convinced. But I do really hope that in the future there might be some further testing that could be done on the fragments to provide us with more information on their origins. Before I finish today, do you fancy one more weird detail that links back to this case? Go on then, you've twisted my arm. As it turns out, the area where the Silpho object was discovered by Frank Dickinson in the 50s was destined to make headlines once again over 3 decades later, for a very different yet weirdly familiar reason. In 1989, the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was due to visit Scarborough for the Conservative Party conference, which was being held in March of that year. Just days before the visit was to take place, a number of strange, out-of-place items were found very close to Broxer Forest by a man out collecting leaf mould on the land. But unlike the flying saucer that Frank had come across so close to this very spot years before, these items were very identifiable. A haul of guns, ammunition, and bomb-making equipment were uncovered, with the police believing they had been stashed there there by those intending to harm people at the upcoming conference. As a similar threat had been detected in Clapham just a few months earlier, the incident prompted a massive security response and was dealt with very swiftly. What I found interesting is that for so many years, the Silpho UFO tale was treated as a bit of an afterthought in articles about otherworldly sightings or encounters, if it ever made it into those articles at all. Yet following the 2018 rediscovery of the pieces, the tide turned, and this big political security threat story became the final thing briefly mentioned in articles that were now being dedicated to this mysterious flying saucer, which, in my eyes, perfectly reflects the enduring nature of our utter fascination with these strange and unidentified objects, wherever in our universe they may have truly come from. Well, friends, there we have it. That was the story of the Silpho Moor UFO incident. I am already looking forward to reading the comments for this one. You never fail to come up with some brilliant thoughts and theories of your own. So if you're joining me on Spotify or YouTube today, feel free to leave me a comment and get involved. Are you a believer in UFOs in general, or are you much more on the skeptical side? Does the Silpho case intrigue you, or do you think there's a simple explanation that covers off every element of this story? Have you ever had a bizarre, otherworldly experience of your own? I cannot wait to hear from you. Before we round off this episode though, we still have time to zoom on over to our outro feature, where I give a shout out to something I've been watching, reading, or listening to in my downtime. Here is Weird Media. I have another podcast recommendation for you today. Ever since I started running, I've been listening to them so much more regularly. And if you're very much into the true crime side of things, then I would highly recommend checking out the Real True Crime podcast by Naomi Channel. Naomi is absolutely incredible. I actually got to spend the day with her recently, along with some other lovely fellow podcast creators, and she is just a powerhouse. She's the creator of a number of true crime projects, including the YouTube channel and podcast Totally True Crime, and of course, the Real True Crime podcast. If you're all about that proper audio documentary kind of style, with shows that focus on justice for the victims of crimes with an absolute abundance of compassion, I have no doubt that this podcast will end up being a true favourite of yours. Naomi is super thorough with her research and gives a real voice to those affected by the crimes she discusses, sometimes even including clips of interviews with people linked to the cases. A lot of her episodes are one-offs, but occasionally she'll do a multi-part series about a particular topic or crime. For example, Naomi recently revisited the case that prompted her to start podcasting in the first place, the murder of Stuart Lubbock, which is very close to her heart. The series was absolutely incredible. I could not stop thinking about it after I'd finished the final part. Naomi is genuinely one of the very best true crime podcasters out there. Her work is something special. And on top of all of it, she is a genuinely lovely, warm and supportive person who deserves all the success in the world. You can find Real True Crime on all of the major podcast players, and I wholeheartedly recommend checking it out for yourself. A big thank you for tuning in to Things Are About to Get Weird today. In the show notes or description box, I'll be including shout outs and links to the sources I used during my research. And I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address too. Please do leave us a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or get in touch on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, or TikTok and tell me all about your thoughts on this story. If you've enjoyed this episode and have a spare moment or two, dropping us a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts is one of the very best free ways to support the show. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you once again for being here today, and I'll be back next week with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.